Hello, and welcome to our webinar entitled Time's Up for Windows 7, How to Position Your Organization for Windows 10 and Beyond. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping rules. This webinar will be recorded, and a link to the webinar will be sent out afterwards. And if there is any questions, please use the Q&A box on the top right-hand side of your screen. And we will take questions after our presenters present. So with that, I'd like to introduce Barry Angel, CTO of Juriba.
Okay, thank you, Michael, and welcome to the webinar, everyone. So, as Michael said, my name is Barry Angel, and I work as the CTO at Juriba, and I'm one of the co-founders of the company 10 or so years ago. I've been in IT over 20 years now, and primarily focused on end-user computing and the IT transformation space. And I'm joined today by Adam. So, Adam, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi, yeah, I'm Adam Jeffries. I'm a senior solution engineer at Flexera. For over 10 years, I've been helping organizations deliver large IT transformation projects due to my background in enterprise architecture. And more recently, I've been getting involved with modernization projects such as cloud migrations and helping customers deliver outcomes around technology insight, cost management, and governance.
Okay, thank you, Adam. So today we are going to be looking at Windows 10 migration and Evergreen IT management. We'll give you an overview of what it's all about and update you on the current market position. Then we'll be looking at how you can accelerate your Windows 10 project, or if you are already there on Windows 10, to start to manage your Windows 10 servicing as part of an Evergreen IT strategy. Adam will be exploring how data can help drive a better understanding of your IT estate in preparation for a migration or upgrade project. And he'll then be focusing on application compatibility and how quick identification of the application remediation workload can drive faster end user adoption for your migration project. We'll then look at how to achieve velocity deployment by using a data-driven approach to your application readiness, and where project command and control tooling can assist with your migration efforts. And then finally, we'll look at how you can build your Windows 10 servicing strategy and what you can do now to position yourself for the first Windows 10 to Windows 10 upgrade. So we'll start the webinar with a reminder that we're now just 10 months away from Windows 7 end of life on January the 14th, 2020. So although this date will see support end, customers will not need a custom support agreement until April the 1st, 2020, as Microsoft just gave organizations an extra 2.5 months to migrate before incurring extra cost. When it does kick in on April the 1st, that cost will be either $25 or $50 per PC per year, depending on the OS edition. And that will escalate after year one, possibly even doubling in year 2 and beyond. So obviously there's a big incentive to get off of Windows 7 as quickly as possible. So interestingly, we're not quite seeing the full scale of adoption of Windows 10 as we'd expected. There was a big early ramp up with the consumer market. There was some early adopters in the enterprise space, but the market share for the OS actually dropped last month. So Windows 7 unbelievably increased share by a small percentage. And what we think this indicates is that many organizations are either stalling with their migration efforts, or there are some big projects that are still yet to start or only just starting now. So we're expecting to see this number grow radically over the next 10 months towards the end of life date. Now, not only do we have to manage a Windows 10 migration, but we also have to consider the ongoing rollouts for Windows 10 as a service. The evolution here is from big bang migrations of the past to a new world of constant change with Windows 10 as a service. No longer can we wait 4 to 5 years between OS upgrades as we did before. So in this graphic, what you can see is the old world on the left-hand side, the blue bars designating the rollouts of Windows XP and Windows 7. And these projects, obviously, as we all know, took a lot of time and budget. You'll also notice the blank spaces. So this is typically where our IT estates suffered from device and application sprawl, with the proliferation of shadow IT, meaning that each project had a lot to fix in the environment to get to the latest OS. Now, as we move to the faster cadence of Windows servicing updates, the constant change is the name of the game. With some highly intrusive updates in the more recent cycles and obviously slipped release deadlines due to issues with the code, this change means that our environments are at a much higher risk of disruption with each release. So in turn, this requires a lot of the impact analysis to happen before we can deploy. You can see this new constant change methodology on the right-hand side of the graphic in green. Now, while the cost of moving to from Windows 7 to Windows 10 is much less than it was for, say, XP to 7, there's still a significant budget required to make the transition at an average of $693 per device. Now, there's only recently been studies on what Windows as a service will mean, and Gartner very recently released a study into what they feel the maintenance cost will be, and that averaged out somewhere between $40 and $69 per device per annum. So that's the kind of budget that we should be looking at to maintain Windows as a service. Now, obviously, the lower number is for the better managed IT estates, the higher number for the more unmanaged estates where users can install their own applications. Now, before we start any project, it is critical to know that what we're dealing with. So over to you, Adam, to talk about how we can better understand our current IT estate.
Thanks, Barry. Absolutely. Let's just take a quick look at this particular quote. I bet it sounds all too familiar to people that are on the call. I hear this all the time, and I'm guessing this will be familiar to many of you. It's actually a quote from one of my customers who are very much a household name, but frankly, it could be any organization, large or small. As Gartner said many years ago, over 40% of IT projects fail because of bad data. And from my experience, this is still as relevant today as it ever was. When you think about the increasing adoption of technology, covering every single aspect of business activity, the inherent complexity this creates, and a relentless pace of change, it means that it's a challenge for any project to have even the basic inventory to work from. And again, surprisingly, if you need to start an end user migration project, it might well prove helpful to know what hardware and software you've got. If I were looking to swap computers or buying a new smart washing machine or whatever, I might turn to Google to search for product information. This would help me understand exactly what products are in these categories, and I could also use it to identify any problems with support or compatibility. It's a similar challenge with a platform migration. To help me get on with the task, I need a technology catalog to quickly identify what I have and highlight any issues. That's what Technopedia provides for people, so that they can have access to standardized information about all of the hardware and software products they're using. Technopedia's got an army of content engineers dedicated to ensuring the content is reliable, relevant, and up to date. The team are making on average over 2,500 updates a day and work to a robust data quality framework built up over years of experience, because at the end of the day, its foundation has to be built on trusted content. If we take a look into Technopedia, it's got some useful information about the compatibility of products to Windows 10. There are around 1 million software releases within Technopedia, and around 25% of these are compatible with Windows 10. Our content team research every product to find data sheets, specification documents, or other proof from the vendor that it's compatible. It's a great way to start categorizing your software assets in terms of the big buckets. What's compatible or incompatible, but also what's end of life and therefore pointless to upgrade unless you've got a very specific business need. You're also going to be left with some that are simply unknown, in this case 13%. For these bad boys, if they still serve a business need, you're going to want an automated method to test compatibility. The key at this stage, however, is providing visibility. Now, I bet you've got multiple systems of record when it comes to your hardware and software inventory. To be honest, chances are you've got at least 2 or 3 different discovery tools going out searching your network. You've also probably got other homegrown systems, databases, spreadsheets, things like that, with further pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. Putting this together is a slow, boring, thankless task, and it's unlikely that the end result will actually even be worth it. Having a look at this sample data sheet, things will fall apart pretty quickly. You're going to have blank, empty spaces, in this case for the publisher. There's going to be numerous naming conventions used for things like publishers or product names. Version numbers might be missing. You might have full version numbers or down to patch level. You don't even know if some of the information is important for the project. So is this something that needs to be migrated or managed, or is it simply noise in the data, such as a language pack, help file, hotfix, or DLL? And we find these are around 90% of discovery data. Having a clean, consistent data set on your inventory is one thing, but I bet it's also not aligned with the market intelligence you actually need to drive your project forward. So do you know out of here what products are Windows 10 compatible? Do you know if there's known vulnerabilities against them? Is it end of life, supported, maybe obsolete? And also at a high level, what does this actually do? Are you looking at multiple conferencing products or an overlapping backup solution, for example? Overcoming these challenges should be as automated as possible, so you can get on with making sure that you're taking informed decisions about how to migrate your users to Windows 10. That's why Flexera provide a data platform to be able to aggregate these sources of information together, filter out the irrelevant information, such as language packs or hotfixes, to then be able to set through a deterministic rule set to be able to definitively match the products that are within the data. If we don't match them, there's an SLA to be able to undertake a gap fill process so that we can fill those gaps so that we know 100% of the products that are in use. It also means that we can start to filter out duplicates and some of the other miscellaneous information that's in the data sheet. Once the blank spaces or products have been identified, blank spaces can be removed, and you can be enriching this information with useful information about the products, such as Windows compatibility or the lifecycle dates. Now, this data can also then be sent downstream to any system which needs to be able to understand the technology inventory and use in the organization. There's a great example of this, Dashworks, which Barry will tell you more about in due course, is a great consumer of this clean and enriched data. The thing to remember here, though, is that the cleaning job is the dirty but essential job to make sure that you can drive some sound decision making on your technology estate. A recent study by Hobson found that organizations using the data platform typically saved around 60% of the time they needed to gather and research technology data, and had an 80 to 75% reduction in efforts managing external and internal audits. So when you do the maths over thousands of systems and millions of rows of discovery data, it's impossible to keep up with these things, and you're going to soon fall behind. Now, ultimately, early on, you also need to start categorizing your options for Windows 10 migration. And these fall into some simple buckets. Is it compatible, not compatible, or does it require testing? Being able to quickly categorize software releases into these buckets lets you focus on the important things, such as, do these apps provide business value? Do you need them? Is there an important decision to be made about what your software estate should be in the future? And now is ultimately the ideal time to be doing that. Having an automated system to process your data and categorize it into these buckets means you have more time to invest in researching the wider questions of business value versus cost, or do we have entitlements or other alternatives? You know, there's always going to be areas to focus more attention on, and requires testing is one such area. It's a phase that can also be automated, though, to help make sure that you can reduce time, but also, and probably more importantly, to reduce errors. This is for Flexera, a product called Admin Studio, and I'm going to introduce that shortly. What all of this means from a practical perspective is that you can get automated reporting on the current status of your estate in terms of compatibility, including viewpoints on vendors or the categorization of the apps that are in use. And a migration project is the perfect opportunity to look at rationalizing your estate and identifying areas for improved alignment to business needs, or perhaps even standardization to save yourself some cash. So having clean, enriched data on your technology inventory is the starting point to helping you make better decisions. It also means that you're not spending your time on the mundane and frankly dirty job of aggregating, cleaning, researching and enriching that's done by the data platform. Once that job's been done, you can start getting on with the nitty-gritty of actually delivering the project. And this is where Barry can help. So over to Barry.
Okay, thanks, Adam. So that's a great look at how we can understand the data and how we can cleanse it. And obviously the next step in that process is to use that insight and turn it into actionable data sets that we can then manage through a project. Now, in order to do that, we have to first understand what happens in most projects. So if you look at the graph, you will see the typical phases and places where a lot of these projects tend to stall. Usually this is in the discovery and assessment phase. So as Adam has said previously, companies can spend months of time trawling tens of thousands of rows of application data just to decide which ones are relevant, which ones are not relevant, normalizing them into point releases and product suites and all of that kind of work that has to go on to just get an understanding of what we have out there. So if we use the Flexera data platform, we can shrink that time significantly and get to the point at which we know what's in scope for the project. Now, the second part of that is the project delivery command and control phase, where if that's managed inefficiently, costs and time scales really can balloon within these projects. And this is shown on the right-hand side. And this is essentially where our project teams are working inefficiently, handling spreadsheets and hand-crank databases. And essentially, you need more and more people to manage this process, a larger project management office. And it's all because of the processes that we're using not really being aligned to the workload that we're trying to achieve across multiple different teams. Now, migration velocity is a much talked about concept, but it's really difficult to achieve when there are so many moving parts and dependencies. However, there is a basic concept around low-hanging migration fruit that we can target. It revolves around the application estate and choosing the best application each time to drive the fastest conversion of green devices. Now, at Juriba, we've worked with customers to identify the mathematically quickest route to get all of the devices in the organization to a green state. By running our algorithm against the data, we can generate a priority list of applications in a 1-to-n order that, if we remediate them in turn, will enable the highest amount of application-ready devices in the fastest possible time. And this approach can drive velocity for any Windows 10 or Windows 10 servicing project, especially where there is a huge amount of application complexity. Now, in this graph, this is actually a customer of ours. So they've got 11,500 seats to migrate. They've got 1,300 applications. And what you can see here is that if we pick the best 20 applications every week, which is what they said they could get ready, by the time we hit week 5, i.e. 100 applications in a ready state, you can see that we've actually achieved over 50% of the estate, or 5,800 devices, into a green readiness state. So effectively, by remediating less than 10% of the applications, we've achieved more than 50% of the devices in a ready state. So this is the kind of mathematics that we can start to use moving forward to help us drive numbers on the board and improve perception of the pace of deployment and the project as a whole. Okay, so what things do we need to think about in planning for this new update cadence of Windows 10 servicing? Well, for your initial migration to Windows 10, you're likely to have to replace a number of devices that won't support Windows 10, especially so considering a lot of the hardware features like UEFI, TPM, and the virtualization required to support Win 10 security. I know of many organizations that will use the hardware refresh lifecycle to drive their migration workload, so tying a Windows 10 update to a hardware refresh that's already planned. Now, applications are a big concern for most organizations, and typically they're the biggest blocker to moving forward on any of these OS migration projects. Now, Adam's covered much of that area, but you also need to think about the impact that the application remediation will have on the business units, and also whether there are any things like licensing costs to upgrade or replace the current applications, because that might be some budget that isn't generally associated to this project and needs to be resolved outside. Now, we also need to think about what deployment process we're going to use. So for the initial migration to Windows 10, you can use in-place upgrade, maybe you prefer a wipe and load approach and get a clean OS build. But there'll be machines that need replacing, so migration of data and apps is also important. Now, ongoing feature updates can be applied and typically will be applied as an in-place upgrade, but you'll still need a process to build new machines to the new release. You'll also want to keep your Windows 10 images refreshed as each feature release or feature upgrade releases, and we'll probably be maintaining at least 2 OS images for a period of time, so as you pilot the new releases. Now, it's also worth looking at Autopilot from Microsoft, which is a new technology, and that's designed to help with this provisioning process and is maturing nicely as new features get added for the enterprise. So the latest release of that will include things like the ability to name your devices according to variables that you can set. Now, there may be constraints on your deployment infrastructure. So if you're using Configuration Manager, you'll need to get onto its current branch and keep that updated in order to maintain support for the Windows 10 feature updates. So CM has to be in line with the Windows 10 desktop side. Now, Windows 10 servicing is going to also involve distribution of a lot of content. So gigabytes of content to every machine. So we also need to think about peer-to-peer content distribution solutions to minimize the amount of infrastructure you need to maintain. And then finally, there's the logistics of actually deploying the OS out to thousands of devices. So determining which devices are ready to upgrade. What capacity do we have within our IT and service desk teams? And this is where automation can really help. And how are you going to communicate the upgrade plans to your end users? So how do we get on top of this and keep up with the cadence that Microsoft is setting? Okay, well, this is where I'm going to do a shameless plug for Juriba's Dashworks product. So the best solution is to implement a project command and control center, one that's constantly in sync with your environment. So the Juriba Dashworks product is really the solution to the problem that I've just outlined. It contains a data warehouse on the left-hand side, and that uses connectors to harvest data from repositories like AD and SCCM, which then refresh on a schedule incrementally. And then other data's layered in, such as the Flexera data platform, information enrichment around the apps and hardware, desktop analytics maybe for Win 10 to 10 compatibility, Flexera Admin Studio for package compatibility, and then also some organizational information for location and business unit layers. Now, on the right-hand side, we have our IT Migration Command and Control Center. So from here, we can manage multiple simultaneous projects, each with their own framework and workflows. This is where we configure the emails to send to the end users, self-service data validation and scheduling, readiness dependencies, asset grouping, and the automation of the deployment logistics. It provides a single version of Project Truth with functionality to drive every aspect of the IT migration effort in real time. And with this tooling in place, you can then much better control the project and make the resources associated to the project as efficient as possible. Now, of course, one major component of any IT migration project is application readiness. So we wanted to spend a little bit more time in this webinar on that piece. And Adam, you can take over again.
Great, thanks. So, yeah, when it comes to really the business end of any migration project, there's a real operational risk that when you upgrade and deploy an application, it just all falls apart. The requires testing bucket needs to be looked at to make sure that the apps play nicely together in the target environment, which also includes making sure it has access to other applications and services it depends on as well. There's also specific versions to those applications and services. You definitely don't want this falling apart once the upgrade has happened, and business users come back screaming about error messages or blue screens or whatever when the apps that they're using to run the business fail. You could get people set up to go through long test scripts and procedures to look at these apps, but you're not really going to get the project completed on time, and you will also miss things. So ultimately, this needs to be an automated process to identify and resolve the issues. Automating your compatibility testing is one thing, and having an initial data set on your inventory to categorize the apps will help reduce this pain, but you also need to get these apps packaged and ready to deploy, as Barry's been saying, onto the new target operating system. So making sure that you can automate those tasks is also going to help make sure that you can keep that project timeline and be able to start delivering real change on a day-by-day basis. Admin Studio provides an IT organization the ability to evaluate applications from their install packages and also help determine Windows 10 compatibility. So this is based on a rule set derived from Microsoft's documented changes from previous operating systems to this one. And if people want to, they can get a high-level overview of this from the Flexera website. Today, Admin Studio only differentiates between Windows 10, 32, and 64-bit, and it also assumes a particular Win 10 build, which is currently 1809. In the next release of Admin Studio, slated for Q2, it will differentiate compatibility for various Windows 10 builds from 1607 to 1809. It will also label particular builds as the long-term service branch for these orgs so that stay on to the release schedule. Now, Admin Studio will be periodically updated to support the latest Windows 10 builds moving forward as well. And as an organization can always quickly reevaluate their current application packages and verify that they're ready for the next Windows 10 build. And this is something that we'll be covering further when we talk a little bit more about evergreening and Windows as a service. But now we can see how you can automate some of the compatibility and packaging challenges. Barry is going to take you over some of the planning to deliver this.
Okay, thanks, Adam. So application readiness is really, the key data point for any OS migration project. And we can utilize that ready state from Admin Studio to determine whether or not a device or a user is good to go for the upgrade alongside other dependencies that could be hardware, user dependencies, site dependencies, business dependencies, and the other things that we manage in Dashworks. So shown here is a quick example of some out-of-the-box Dashworks reporting and a typical self-service communication to the end user to ask them to verify and validate their application list in this case, and which apps they still need moving forward. Now, once the device is green and ready for scheduling, Dashworks can then manage a capacity limit against the organization to ensure that only, for example, so many devices can be upgraded in this business unit at this location per day, and maybe the slots are AM, PM, or hourly slots, or over the night time period. So what you're looking at here is essentially how we utilize that data in Dashworks to then drive a migration project. Now, as the device gets scheduled, you can also make the entire process user initiated. So with these days of self-service, it's important that we get our user engagement as high as possible. Now here we have a screenshot from Flexera's App Broker platform that shows how a user can trigger their own migration at a time suitable to them, but within that time window that's been defined earlier for the project. So this trigger, if clicked, would then initiate the appropriate action within SCCM to begin the upgrade process, associate the correct new apps, and ultimately deploy back down to the end user an upgrade package that essentially gets them from their current version 1803 over to the new version 1809 with the associated changes that are required within that process. So now we're going to look at the Windows as a Service strategy. So this is probably the hottest topic with all our customers at Juriba. So let's look a bit more into the process of updating your devices from Release A, Windows 10, to Release B of Windows 10. Now, as you'll see, this isn't just a technical process, which is a common pitfall that most organizations fall into, and frustratingly sometimes how Microsoft push this, being much more a technical process than a people process. But in our experience, both are as important. Now at Juriba, we typically break this upgrade cycle into 5 distinct phases that you can see running along the bottom. Now the first is to baseline exactly what you have in your environment. So who is using what, where, when, whom, and how are they using it? And all of this kind of information is obviously enriched significantly with Flexera Data Platform. Now you'll also be recreating your core image, and you'll be making any settings changes and new functionality that's available within the latest OS feature release. In parallel, you'll need to assess your environment to scope the effort required for the upgrade. So if you've decided to keep certain versions of the OS in play within your organization, you might only be updating each cycle a subset of your machines. Now we need to understand which hardware and applications will still work against the latest OS release, and we'll need replacing. And you'll also need to consider where each asset is in its life cycle. So is this software application end of life and due for refresh or replacement? Is this piece of hardware due a refresh anyway, for example? And now we know what we need to do. Each asset must be categorized, so for both the hardware upgrade path and the application upgrade path. And from here we can start to define our deployment rings and prioritize our remediation work. So in an application estate, we may still decide to use 1809, for example, as the opportunity to rationalize a bunch of Adobe Reader versions down to 1, for example. Now, the third stage is to start tracking readiness. Now, this isn't just about apps and hardware, but also infrastructure readiness, business readiness, and certain other key elements that make a device suitable and green for migration. So we might need to upgrade CM, for example, in a particular site to support the new release, or a business might have a major application release that means that we can't touch that business unit for a certain period whilst they are in a change freeze. And now that your devices are turning green, we can move into scheduling and logistics. So we recommend here that you employ self-service to drive rationalization efforts and migration volumes, and leverage end-user communications to inform your end users as to what's happening and when, and then self-service to engage them in the process. And then finally, there's the technical deployment, so typically through SCCM collections or equivalent, and often this will be capacity constrained, so both in terms of the network and the service desk. So we need to take that into account and potentially look at technologies that can help distribute those packages in a drip feed way, whether it's peer-to-peer or tools like Adaptiva, 1E and others that are out there in the market. And once we're through, it's really then straight onto the next release. So we're expecting that each enterprise now will do a take of the 09 releases and manage those in a 12-month cycle. So we need to make sure that that whole process is very repeatable and industrialized so that we're not reinventing the wheel as we may have done for our big bang Windows OS migration projects. So let's talk quickly about deployment rings. So deployment rings are a Microsoft concept, but really they're nothing new. They're essentially the same as what we've been doing for patch management for years and years. But defining these deployment rings is really a key element of getting this process successful. So we should start with some definitions. A deployment ring is simply a logical grouping of your assets. So it could be by business unit, could be by location, could be by function, or another set of criteria. It just might be a pilot across a certain set of devices. So if we imagine we've got an organization of 30,000 machines, we might decide that we want 3,000 machines in pilot phases, and we've got 27,000 to deploy over 10 broad waves of 2,700 devices. And the deployment rings are just simply how we split those up between who goes first and who goes last. So it sounds very simple, but there is definitely some maths to consider here. So if we put, let's say, all of IT in our pilot phases, it probably means that we have to ready most of our applications because IT is the heaviest application user in any organization. Now, whether they're using them functionally or not, they exist on the machine and therefore would be part of any analysis. So the velocity can just hit a brick wall because you just created a deployment ring that effectively creates too much work to get it done in the time frame we've managed. So this will stall the rest of the rollout. So really what's important here is to do a couple of things with deployment rings. Number one is to ensure that devices in the early pilot rings give you as much key application coverage as possible. And number two, and this is very much a future thing, is to ensure that the applications that are included in those pilot rings are receiving the appropriate performance analytics and, where applicable, business sign-off. So what we're seeing in the market is that a percentage of the applications will always go through significant business unit testing. We're not going to have a trading floor, for example, that's not going to have Reuters or Bloomberg tested. But we may have applications in a back office that are only used by a few users that don't need testing. So there should be a segmentation of your applications into those that do need testing, those that don't. And then what happens if we can use the data from the performance analytics to drive the issue log, then we can start to say, okay, well, we've deployed this OS to these machines. That's given us application coverage of these applications. Two of those machines are seeing issues, and we can then start to look at the common elements on those machines and see if one of those applications is performing poorly against the new OS version. Then we can change it red in Dashworks and stop any subsequent rollouts of that particular application or devices that use that application without doing some further testing. So getting the deployment rings right for your organization is going to require some detailed analysis. But once we've set those deployment rings, this is how we repeat the process, and we can tweak those deployment rings per project to gain the required acceleration. Now, in this slide, what you'll see on the left is a typical deployment timeline, and it's something that generally this is what people have accepted over the last 10, 20 years of doing IT migration projects. So a very slow ramp up, often caused by things like the IT pilot issue that I discussed previously, and high volumes towards the end of the process. And obviously if that slips, that's where the cost and the time drain will appear. Now, in the new world, this type of timeline, it just won't work because we've got too much risk associated to it. So this is why we need to move much more towards the graph on the right. Now, what we're doing here is we have the same initial workload to get things ready, but we're accelerating early deployment to achieve the timeline. Now, the key to this acceleration is to do things differently from the past. So by creating deployment rings on application spread, I can analyze which of my applications turn the most devices green, and then I can immediately identify who should be in my initial deployment rings. Now, you can further layer on accelerators like self-service validation and scheduling, and the ability to deploy as soon as the asset is ready, maybe even outside of the deployment rings, such as in a break-fix scenario. And of course, you can't do any of this really without the right tooling in place. So trying to manage this on spreadsheets, then that type of complexity is going to be very difficult to handle over the short period of time we have to get these rollouts done. And we're going to make a lot of errors in there, and we're also going to probably reinvent the wheel with each OS release. Now, of course, it's not just about the Windows operating system, but it's also about the hardware and application lifecycle. So how do we build these extra elements into our Evergreen IT strategy? So Adam, if you can have a look at the enrichment of the data that we can use to help that situation.
Absolutely, yeah. So, you know, there's a number of different aspects to thinking about IT evergreening. And that's why with Technopedia subscriptions, you get a baseline information about the technology assets, but also a selection of content packs which provide useful information for specific projects or use cases. Now, we're obviously focusing on end user compute today, but you know, IT is constantly changing, and this is becoming a much wider problem around migration and modernization. And so especially when you start thinking about evergreening, there's other aspects in your IT estate that come to bear. So, for example, if you want to know the power consumption of hardware in your data center, the hardware specification content pack gives you that insight. You could then improve your efficiency or lower your data center bills. You could also use it to inform a cloud migration project, so that you can look at building a business case for decommissioning your colo or wholly owned data centers. You know, we want this content to be as relevant as possible. So some have recently been removed, and we're busy adding others so that, for example, we're bringing in a facilities management content pack. Now, our customers are telling us more and more about IoT devices, and smart offices, lighting, lifts, air cons, etc. And so we're going to provide them the technology insights so they can start looking at the lifecycle, connectivity, and integration with those external systems. If we get back to really thinking about evergreening in terms of desktop, though, then lifecycle and support information can give you detailed data about end-of-life dates, or when is this product no longer in standard support, and basically when is this going to start costing you more money to extend support, and when is there going to be no support paid or otherwise. It's also going to tell you the support policies available for the product. And in some cases, such as network operating systems or such like that, will give you vulnerability support end dates. So it's hardly a surprise, but this is very popular with companies we work with to make sure that they can look at optimizing their roadmap, making sure that their technology change is aligned with their strategy and the technology that they're currently using in the organization. And in today's world, it's not just about making sure you aren't paying extra support for products you don't need, but helping to teams such as security to remove any obsolete products. You simply won't get updates or patches to remediate a vulnerable product. You know, we want to help companies stay out of the news for the wrong reasons. Now, back over to Barry, and he's going to talk to you really about how we can start delivering on that promise of IT evergreening.
Okay, thanks, Adam. So what we're looking at here is what Evergreen means to us at Juriba. So essentially in this screenshot, what you can see here is that we have a device that's running Windows 10, and this particular device is part of 5 Evergreen projects. Now, those projects might be transformational, they could be lifecycle projects, or they could be simply a ongoing refresh of a particular element. So in our case, we can see that this device is going to get a hardware refresh. It's going to get Office, a new version of Office. It's going to get Skype for Business, and it's already onboarded into a couple of Windows 10 feature release update projects. Now, the benefit here is that we can start to finally see within an asset's life cycle what's going to happen to it in the forthcoming months. And what we can do here is then start to work with our BAU teams that if, for example, this machine had a hard drive failure, we can see that this device is actually ready for 1803. So the service delivery break fix resource could take that hard drive, they could swap it out, they could also migrate that device at the same time to 1803 because they can see it's ready. So ultimately, it's about also trying to drive efficiencies within our BAU teams, because the BAU teams quite often are who are going to be running a lot of these projects. Okay, so we just wanted to finalise the webinar on a quick discussion of the things that we can do now to position your organisation for the Windows 10 servicing. So this is by no means a list of everything you could do, but we think this is a good starting point. So number one is always to get the organisational culture ready for it. So does everyone in your organisation know what's about to hit them in terms of these ongoing updates, especially our application owners? Do they know that they're going to have to be potentially testing and remediating applications every 12 months within that release cycle and against a time window? Secondly, we need to start defining the perfect deployment strategy for your organisation. So it might be a theoretical exercise, but it will help you understand what's going to be involved. Start thinking about what the deployment rings are going to look like for you. Now, the third item is to think about setting up a function to manage the as-a-service model. So, of course, we're not just looking at Windows 10. You may also have things like Office 365 Pro Plus clients, SCCM updates. You're going to be rolling applications. You're going to be end-of-lifing other things. So you might be moving to Edge as your new browser, for example. So a dedicated function might be a good idea for most organizations, because simply swallowing this in BAU may be too much extra workload for those guys to handle. Now, we should also make sure that we've documented our end-to-end processes and workflow for managing the upgrades. So what needs to happen and when, and how are we going to communicate in a repeatable fashion, how we're going to manage app testing, manage scheduling, and the like of those items. And then finally, we should really start to consider whether your existing tooling is sufficient to manage the process repeatably. So, of course, we'd love you to look at Juriba dashboards for the project command and control, and into the Flexera product suite for all of the data analysis, cleansing, enrichment, and readiness that we can complement with the project command and control center. Now, both of these tools together would help you much better plan, manage, and execute deployments in a much more automated fashion than you might be used to. And this really is the future. We have to get to a point at which this process is as automated as possible. So with that, I hope you found the session useful. And let's see if we've got any questions. Okay, so I'm just opening up the list here. So we've got a question, how can the applications be rationalized using dashboards for every feature update? Okay, so that's a very good question. So as you saw in the screenshot earlier, each feature update is effectively a separate project within Dashworks. So therefore, applications are onboarded into each project individually, and we can make different decisions per project. So we may have an application which is being kept for 1803, but then gets rationalized for 1809 to a different version. So because the Dashworks platform is running those as separate projects, you can mark it as a keep application on the 1803 project, and you can mark it as a forward path application on the 1809. So consequently, you can rationalize across the projects in a different way per project if that's the way that you want to go. Equally, we can take the rule set out of one project and apply it to a second project. So if we've already rationalized, but we notice in the estate that the old versions reappeared on a couple of devices, we could then automatically forward path that to the new one as part of the new project. So ultimately, it's about really understanding current state, target state mapping, but doing that individually for each project so that you can have an app that's effectively green for 1803 but might turn red for 1809 because we need to do something with it. And that something with it could be a license update or a rationalization or forward pathing it to another functionally similar application. Okay, so I don't know, Adam, if this is one you can answer, but we've got a question here. What is the pace of the third-party core applications drivers made ready for each feature release? So do we have any information at this point about how quickly application vendors are changing the data set within the Flexera data platform?
In terms of the data set itself, it's being changed on a daily basis. So there's numerous thousands of different updates that's going on into the catalog to be able to make sure that you can get up-to-date information from those vendors. That also is obviously in play with tools like Admin Studio to make sure that they've got all of the right kind of logic for testing, compatibility, and upgrading. But yeah, it's a constantly changing picture every day.
Okay, great stuff. Okay, so we've got another question here. How will businesses be impacted if the Windows 10 feature update adoption rate is slow by organisations? Now, this is a great question, and it actually is what certain organisations are seeing today. So we had quite a few early adopters of Windows 10 that might have rolled out 15.11, 16.07, and didn't really then start to manage the servicing update. So they're still running that same old version. Now, of course, that version has gone out of date, and now suddenly we are seeing issues because that cadence of change has effectively been ignored. Now, Microsoft kept changing the support lifecycle for those early releases. So, as you guys will have seen, typically these things kept getting pushed out by 3 to 6 months, give people more time to do the upgrades. But a lot of organisations didn't have the people, process and tooling in place to manage them. So ultimately, the answer is that if the adoption rate is slow by organisations, the Microsoft cadence is not now going to change. They've made a complete line in the sand that these versions of the OS will go out of date and they will not be supported any further. So the ultimate answer is that we have to drive the cadence, we have to drive the technology change, and we have to put the process in place to keep them in lifecycle, because going out of lifecycle isn't really an option from a Microsoft perspective. We can't just expect them to keep extending support. Now, of course, that does drive business impact. So if we've got in-house applications and they need remediating, it does give us a much faster timeline by which we need to do them. And this is why Microsoft have released, the solutions like the App Assure and other items that have basically given us another backstop from which we can remediate those applications and hopefully get them into the right cadence. But of course, I think there is a huge risk. That's why it's such a great question. There's a huge risk that we cannot do or achieve this cadence of change within certain organisations, given the application complexity that they have. And that's why we have to use the data much more effectively to drive that velocity and drive that deployment as quickly as possible. Okay, so we've got a question here about Windows Analytics. So this is something. So the question is, how safe is it to keep Windows Analytics data on the cloud? Now that's much more a Microsoft question really than it is something that we can answer in this webinar. But ultimately, Microsoft are asking customers, if you want to use Windows Analytics to do some of the device driver and application compatibility on a vendor perspective, if you want to use that solution, you have to effectively turn on telemetry, and you have to then agree to your data being up in the cloud. Now, the data being up in the cloud comes in two formats. There's a slimline format and there's a full format. So ultimately, it's up to you whether or not you want to send just the slim data or the full data, and then they will use that data within their data warehouses to analyze and assess how many times each of these applications is out there in the live on each particular version of Windows 10, and that's typically used to then derive compatibility with the target OS. So essentially they're saying that if they see it on more than 100,000 devices, they assume that this application is going to be okay on that version of Windows 10. So again, I can't really answer how safe it is, but I know that obviously it's going within the Microsoft Azure cloud. So essentially, you know, that's a question for them as to what they're using to transport it, and you know, how safe that data is, and exactly what data is probably as important. So what data is being pushed to the cloud. Okay.
Yeah, so if I can probably add to that a little bit, just in terms of Technopedia data, we're not storing any kind of customer-specific data in the cloud. We have our team of researchers and content engineers who go out to try and actually identify these products. It's not based on kind of rule of thumb or heuristics or kind of, you know, second guessing that these things are going to work. So I think that's also important. There's also one question that I've seen coming in that's talking about how we'll address network WAN LAN shortcomings. By shortcomings, I mean circuit bandwidth to apply silent upgrades. Now, if that's coming from the kind of Flexera side, the Admin Studio will integrate with a wide range of different deployment options, so things like SCCM. It will do the packaging and testing, but then it uses those the deployment tools to actually enact those changes. So it's more of a question for those particular tools.
Okay, thanks, Adam. And looks like we've got one final one. So can you import the lifecycle data from Flexera into tools like ServiceNow?
Yes, absolutely. So there's a couple of options here. People are going to want to, or our customers want to be able to make sure that they can get this clean and enriched inventory data into their CMDB firstly, so that they can drive a lot of the benefits of having, you know, identified products. There's no kind of second guessing what's in that CMDB. You can start to get to quick resolution times when they're looking at kind of outages and things like that. In terms of lifecycle, there is also the ability to bring into ServiceNow or other CMDBs the product catalog from Technopedia. That gives you instant access to those 2.5 million products that are in Technopedia. And it also means that you can import the lifecycle information. So if you're starting to use things like the application portfolio management options in ServiceNow to start looking at technology change and road mapping, you can start to use that data within that tool.
Okay, brilliant stuff. All right, well, thanks ever so much, Adam. So I think we're nearly at the top of the hour. I think that's the last of the questions we've got time to answer. If there's any questions that are in the list that we didn't get to, we'll answer them offline. Back to you. But I'd like to thank you, along with Adam, for attending today. I hope you found the session useful, and the recording link will be sent out to you straight after this session, so you'll be able to watch it back or watch components of it back, or if people missed it and you want to share it, you can also provide the link that way. So thank you again. Very much appreciate the time you've spent with us. And we're looking forward to the next webinar, which will focus quite significantly on further Evergreen IT and lifecycle management strategies that you can employ. So thank you again.